That was very official. So I've done the housekeeping. Sorry, you can see I'm new to this. This is our first Zoom event, so welcome. My name's Anna MacDonald, and I'm one of the booksellers here at the Paperback Bookshop, and I am physically here at the Paperback Bookshop on Burke Street in Melbourne's CBD, which is and was and always will be on the land of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So it's such a thrill to be here and to relaunch our Salon series after a longer than expected hiatus during one lockdown and another over the last 18 months. And with the relaunch, we've added a couple of new and exciting twists. So obviously we're doing them online, which has actually been a real and unexpected boon for us. We weren't sure how it would go, but it's been wonderful to see the response rate to this event and to the Salon series as a whole. We've got people signing in from Melbourne, but also regional, Australia, interstate, even overseas. So welcome and thank you all for coming. As I said, we'll also be uploading these events, the ones that we record, onto our YouTube channel. And in parallel with this series, we will also be launching a series of pamphlets, limited edition pamphlets, which will be free, but we're only printing 50 copies of each, and you'll be able to order those through our online bookshop, or when you're allowed back into the shop, you can pick them up in the shop. And those pamphlets will include a combination of a transcription of the conversation that we have with each of the featured writers, and also a brand new, newly commissioned work that each writer will prepare in anticipation of the event. I'm fortunate enough to have been able to read Kate's text, which she sent through a couple of days ago. It's fantastic, and no doubt we'll kind of talk a little bit about what she says in that, as well as her wonderful book, The Shut-ins, which we're here to talk about this evening. So with that, I would like to introduce Kate, or Katherine Brabon. So Katherine, in fact, it seems kind of perfect that we're kind of featuring Katherine as our first Salon event this time around, because we hosted you, Katherine, I think in 2016, when your first novel, The Memory Artist, which won the Vogel Prize, came out at the very first year that we had these salons. So it's lovely to welcome you back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
As well as winning the Vogel Award for her first novel, The Memory Artist, Katherine is a regular contributor to Lindsay Magazine and among other periodicals and journals. And I think you've also just won or been awarded a pretty fantastic Varuna Fellowship. Yeah, for a new work.
Yeah, to get some writing done on the next book.
Yeah. So you get to go to Varuna to do that?
That's right, yeah, hopefully. So the plan is next year. Early next year. To work on my third book for 3 weeks. So it's a real, it's a real privilege.
Yeah, so congratulations with that too, Kate. And I thought I might start with what might seem like, well, it's a bit of an icebreaker, I suppose, but it also is intended to lead us into our conversation about the shut-ins specifically. I can see from the piece that you gave us to go in the pamphlet how other writers and other books and so on influence your work. In the piece you gave us for the pamphlet, you talk about Virginia Woolf, Ali Smith, and W.G. Zabald, among other kind of wonderful authors. So I was wondering, Kate, what you're reading at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you so much, Paperback, for having me, and just the support as well. It's you know, it's a weird year to be launching a book, and to be able to do this is a real privilege. I'm glad you mentioned Zavold and Ali Smith, because they're books I'm going to mention. I actually brought them in with me because I was very excited by you asking me what I'm reading. I actually just read Ali Smith's Artful, and it was gorgeous, and it really inspired the piece I wrote for this event, because she it's divided into 4 sections, and one is sort of on edges, one is on reflection, and it interweaves fiction and non-fiction in really interesting ways, which is sort of things that I'm trying to do and have tried to do a bit in shut-ins and I'm trying to do in the new work. So that's what I just read, and currently reading is one I just picked up from Paperback bookshops, because fortunately it's in my radius, is Simone de Beauvoir's newly discovered novella, and it's translated by Lauren Elkin, and yeah, reminds me a bit of Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friends series. That female friendships in fiction is really interesting. So I'm reading those, but I also should say that my connection with Anna goes back a long time, because we met at Monash Uni when I was first starting my PhD there. I sort of turned up to the uni quite unsure of things, but I saw that there was this talk about truth in fiction, and I thought, oh, that sounds really interesting. So I went, and this very articulate, knowledgeable woman, Anna MacDonald, was giving this talk about W.G. Zavold, a writer I'd never heard of, and I then went to her talk, was blown away by it, went home and read all of Zavold's work, and it was very, very formative for me as a writer, starting my PhD in creative writing, not having really written anything beyond a short story. So I just sort of want to acknowledge that we go back a long way, and I'm grateful for your support throughout, Anna.
Oh, thank you so much, Katherine. That's so lovely. And I was thinking too today about that first coffee we had, and talking about Zavold and other very interesting things. So it's lovely to be able to talk in this way and continue the conversation. And one of the, I'm so glad you brought up Ali Smith's Artful, because I think too, when you were talking about it, one of the things because I hadn't read it until after I'd read her seasonal quartet, but it became so clear to me that these were ideas that she had been kind of tossing around, and themes that she had been exploring, because Artful comes quite a bit before the seasonal quartet, but that lovely kind of correlation between the fictive and the non-fictive, or wherever those boundaries are, and I'm never quite sure. And that's one of the things that I love most about this kind of writing. So it's wonderful to see you kind of drawing on that and developing it more and more in your own work as well. And that's one thing that maybe we'll talk about perhaps in relation to the shut-ins, is how the kind of framing narrative works with these kind of more traditionally fictional narratives, I suppose. But I thought that I would tell you too, one of the books that I'm reading at the moment, I've got a few on the go, but because it was a lovely kind of coincidental parallel that emerged when I was rereading the shut-ins just now, and that's Ali and I are reading in the evenings after dinner when we need a break from Netflix, which, to be honest, is quite often these days. We've overdone it. We're reading Haruki Murakami, After Dark, and don't tell me what happens, because it's at that wonderful, weird, I don't really know what's happening kind of place at the moment. But that seemed to me to be there are lovely kind of echoes happening in my reading, between reading the shut-ins during the day and reading After Dark during the evening, in those kinds of themes that come through in your work. And so I just want to launch into the shut-ins finally. I'll just give, I know that quite a few of the people who are here have actually read it already, but I might just give a very quick précis to give a bit of context. So there's a framing narrative narrated by an unnamed narrator, which takes the form of notes, almost kind of research or diary or journal entry kind of notes. I've assumed she's a woman, although it's never made exactly clear, who's travelled from Melbourne to Japan. And then there are 4 interlinked narratives, some written in the first person and some written in the third person, 4 different characters whose lives all cross over in some way. There's Mei, Sadako, is it Sadako?
Yes.
Yep. Hiromi and Hikaru. At the center of the shut-ins is Hikaru, although we don't see him, in fact, for most of the novel, except through other people's versions of him, who is an hikikomori. And then the other characters are his mother, a childhood friend, and another woman, Sadako, who has a kind of tangential relationship with Mei, Hikaru's childhood friend. But one of the things that comes through all of their lives and that drives each of these characters in some way is this idea of ashiragawa, which is a Japanese term that you return to kind of again and again. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit about what ashiragawa is and how you came upon it.
Yeah, sure. So I think well, with my first book, I had done a lot of research to sort of create that, and I think that researcher mindset was still with me in this, like writing this book and wanting to write about Japan. And so I think I was reading Murakami just as a reader, but then I started to delve a little bit more into sort of the writing about Murakami, and it turns out there's this whole scholarship about him. There's just so many books about his books and so much scholarship, and some of them talk about his work using this word ashiragawa, and it translates kind of as over there, and kochiragawa translates as sort of the here or this side. And so I guess for me, like, I don't speak Japanese, but the word was an interesting kind of entry point into sort of a way of thinking, I suppose, like about thinking about Japan. But then, so the word sort of the other side could mean sort of the unconscious. I sort of create a bit of a definition for the book, like the unconscious, the dream world. But also I think I'm interested in how these words work in sort of in an everyday life sense as well. So for me, it was sort of also representing the pull towards that thing. And I think that ends up being really powerful for me, sort of trying to create these characters as a pull towards some other side, whether that's sort of another life, another something out there. So that word, I sort of, in Murakami's books, it means sort of that dream world, but a lot of his books are sort of, operating in the real world on one level, but then there's always this hint of like the other world, the other side. Like a character will, for example, go into a well and delve and go into like a daydream for hundreds of pages in the novel. And that's very much very real, and it's a way of accessing some other internal, maybe desires or unacknowledged need or trauma. The Wind Up Bird Chronicle has that scene, and that's about sort of accessing trauma through going to the other side. So there was sort of, I liked that it could mean so many things, but I think I've probably interpreted it in a very specific way for the book. Whether that's like the only way to interpret it, I'm not sure, but it was an interesting sort of, I guess, instigator into exploring these characters sort of through that kind of a concept, I suppose.
There is, just when you were talking about that kind of the possibility of ashiragawa as a kind of dream state, because there are, even in these little kind of almost side characters or side notes that happen throughout the book, these wonderful dreamlike states. Like there's one that really resonated with me is the woman who ended her marriage because she felt that she was guilty of adultery, even though technically she had never had any kind of adulterous experience or thoughts, but because she was so in love with a garden, and a garden that she wanted to spend time with instead of spending time with her husband, that she, I mean, that's just such an amazing
I'm so
image.
glad you picked up on that. I completely stole it from Camus, I have to admit, though. He has this amazing story called The Adulterous Woman. I think it's sitting up there. That wasn't planned, but it's in a short story collection there. And I've used that premise I've written a short story about that too. I found that, I'm glad you picked up on that, because I found that so powerful too. That in the short story, the woman, she feels like she's sort of in this constrained marriage, and it's them traveling through Algeria. He's a traveling salesman, and they stop in a hotel for one night, and he talks about sort of the cold of the desert nights in Algeria. And then she leaves the hotel room alone one night and just goes and stands like on sort of I guess a structure with some kind of view looking out. And that's her adulterous moment. And I found that so fascinating because she felt it internally. So glad you picked up on it, but I had to acknowledge where I got it from.
I loved it. I mean, there were others there were so many of those little moments that I really loved. But maybe this is a good time for you to do a little reading to give us a bit of a taste of some of one or two of the inner lives in this novel. So I think you're going to read first from May's section.
Yes, yeah, sure. So I've got my page numbers here. So I'm going to read from the first character is Mai, and she here is talking about Hikaru, her childhood friend, and she's sort of reflecting on, I guess, her relationship with him, but particularly how he was as a child. And I'm then also going to jump to another section where after she runs into his mother in the subway in Nagoya, where they live, the mother asks if Mai will write some letters to her son, who hasn't left his room in years now, and whether she'll write to him. So Mai says yes. And so I'm just also going to read a little bit after that when Mai starts writing to him. Hikaru was a strange child. We were in class together at elementary school. At school, we follow a path paved by everything we have grown up with and the paths of our parents and grandparents. The path is laid out for all of us, but taking it did not come naturally to Hikaru. I don't know how to account for this. He was different. He did not respond to questions that were asked out of custom, questions to which the answer was obvious. He seemed to find it difficult to laugh with classmates, as though he could not force himself to laugh in situations when to do so would have brought him into any group, if he'd just played along. The concept of banter seemed beyond him. When we were younger, Hikaru would sometimes bear bruises from being pinched or shoved against walls. When we were older, Hikaru grew taller than everyone, and so the other students just taunted him or pretended he wasn't there, tall and invisible in the crowd. He let his hair grow past his ears. The teachers often punished him for this and must have ordered his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sato, to make sure their son was better groomed, because every now and then he came to school with a severe haircut that seemed like a kind of abuse. On the weekends, if I happened to see Hikaru, he wore the same clothes, a tattered purple and white t-shirt, grey tracksuit trousers, and, when it was cold, a hooded zip-up jacket. I don't recall that we were good friends in elementary school, but I was aware of him enough that when we both began at the same high school, at the age of 13, I recognised him. We shared a desk and sat in silence. One day, on my way to school, I saw Hikaru walking. It must have been early in the school year because the morning was warmer than usual, and I remember the sun hitting the concrete buildings. At work the following week, I write another letter to Hikaru. I say that the encounter with his mother made me remember the abandoned construction site we used to stop at on our way to school. This place at my desk, where usually I sit between classes, preparing for the next lesson or eating a rushed lunch, has changed. All of my usual actions now seem altered to me. I walk to a cafe selling steamed buns. I order cold tea because the warm cafe air is suffocating. I greet my colleagues, teach classes, attend the required meetings. All of these things are changed now. The presence of something unknown to others, the letters to Hikaru, this secret person who would be a source of shame, has shifted something in my life. A small fire has formed. It is bright, yet it burns with guilt. My life, in comparison to what Hikaru has done, his rejection, is very different. The path was presented to me, and I took the path. Hikaru has strayed so far from the path, perhaps he will never find it again. After the next visit, my second letter to Hikaru, Hiromi Sato hands me an envelope. Her two thumbs imprint small creases with her grip. She says nothing except "Thank you, Mai." I take the envelope and thank her in return. On the subway home, I think about when we started junior high and Hikaru and I sat next to each other. Perhaps because of this, we gravitated towards one another in the schoolyard. It's painful to remember that nobody else was drawn to Hikaru, unless to inflict pain on him. His quietness was punctuated by bursts of talkativeness, but only to me, about things that excited him, like the abandoned construction site or far-off places like Hokkaido, where you could see the red-crowned crane dance in the snow, or America, where everything was so unlike Japan and everyone drives a car at 16. He could talk only about the things he was interested in, and only at certain times, otherwise he was silent. The chatter of children coursed past him like a fast river. Hikaru floated in his own current that never intersected with another for long, that never let anyone else be pulled along with him. I open the envelope and see a crisp, clean 10,000 yen bill. So new it is as though it was printed just before Hiromi Sato put it in an envelope, as if it contains only our fingerprints.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And there's so much that's so important to the whole novel, just in that kind of short section you read. One thing I think is the difficulty of communicating and of making oneself understood, but also of understanding another person, which runs throughout. And another is that sense of social structures and the expected path, and what happens if, for instance, if you're like Hikaru, he can't pretend, he can't kind of put on, there's references in Hikaru's section to people wearing masks and so on. He can't do that. And that's one of the things that makes all of these, so the novel, it seems to me, in some ways about this struggle that each of the characters experiences, and each of them is shut in their own kind of way. Do you think?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think I see going back to Achiragawa, that word, that concept of this side and the other side, I think on a very sort of kind of an easy metaphorical level, like the public and private face was really, really kind of interesting to me. And I think that's something that I've often quite been interested in. I think particularly, I guess maybe as a writer, you feel like your most sort of maybe true self and true face is sometimes not the one out in the world. And so I guess that idea really resonated with me. So I think, and all of the sort of reading that I've been doing about Japan and about hikikomori, like this idea of being shut in, was so linked to the sort of the cultural environment, but also I guess just the structures, and I use that word quite a lot, like structures of day-to-day life. And you know, every society has these structures, and they sort of they form expectations on how a person should live. They're quite they feel self-imposed, I suppose, in a lot of ways, because then people feel like they like have to do that and have to do something. But I guess I'm interested in sort of what's beyond that. Like, is that really like someone's will? Is that really what they want to do? And I was really interested in that point where like several characters are all thinking that. So I'm sort of glad you like brought up that idea of like the shut-ins is not just Hikaru in this book. And I think everyone for certain reasons is sort of perhaps at a point of, if not actively questioning the way they live and the structures they've lived by, they're at least sort of in a moment of real discomfort with them. So I sort of, like quite a few people said to me, oh, it's quite a tense, unsettling feeling throughout the book. And I think it is, because it never, maybe I didn't want it to permit any real epiphany moment. I liked the idea of sort of slowly bringing each of the four characters to this sort of point. And in the essay I've written for this event, I talk about this idea of the edge and the precipice, and sort of that idea of bringing each character to that point, but never sort of fulfilling it. And I think that's tied to me always having a bit of a interest in challenging plot structures and things like that. But yeah, so the other side at Chiragawa was sort of so interesting to me on sort of a formal level as well, and how the novel could be constructed, like putting each character sort of at that point of wanting to access it, or wondering what it is, or like questioning like which side am I actually on. All of those things were sort of really interesting to explore.
And I think I'm so glad that you didn't resolve everything, that you left, because I think, yes, it's kind of an unsettling reading process, but it's also a very suspenseful reading process. Like, even though it's quite a quiet novel in many ways, I'm reading, I want to know what's going to happen next. It's a bit like reading a mystery kind of novel, and I have my own ideas about which I'm not going to share, because I don't want to impose those on any other readers, because part of the pleasure is the not knowing and the wondering. But I have my own ideas about M, the unnamed narrator's friend, and M's friend, who the narrator is writing to, during her travel plan. But that sense that all of this is still in process, and that you're reaching perhaps to get to the other side, and maybe Hikaru, well, certainly at one point one of the characters says that Hikaru has gone the furthest in that direction, but he's not the only one who's doing that. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you about, this idea of Achiragawa, it's not a place, it's not a physical kind of a place that you can go. And you've spoken about this idea of a kind of longing. I feel that perhaps some of the characters and I as a reader relate to it, it's that same kind of desire to be elsewhere. Like, I feel like it is a place that I might be able to reach. And, a sense of place is so important in your work, both in The Memory Artist through parts of Russia, and in the shut-ins. I've never been to Japan, but I felt that I was there, and that sense of kind of oppressive humidity too, I felt was really kind of interesting, added another layer of kind of claustrophobia to the novel. And I wanted to ask a bit about the process of your research. You went there, but you talk in the piece that you wrote for us about learning ink drawing. So I'm wondering, were there less conventional kind of ways that you researched for this novel?
Yeah, that's a great way of phrasing it, because I think with the memory artist, that sort of started with me being, you know, a history student and doing my master's and thinking, I'm not very good at writing academic pieces, and I just thought, oh, it's not really my, you know, my strength. And then, you know, finding prose as sort of another form to kind of express what I knew. A lot of it was very like, I'd been to Russia a couple of times, but it was very books heavy kind of research. Whereas this book, I think from the start, I wanted the research to hang much more lightly. I really wanted it to be like the memory artist is so like intertextual. It's sort of very heavy with layers of sort of other books I'd read, and like the research was really quite obvious. Whereas this book, I didn't like want it to be like that. But I think it also, I think the writing lent itself to that, because I felt a much more personal relationship with like Japan through Japanese friends. So I think that was a really nice sort of way into it. So my first trip to Japan was 2014. So I was sort of very early days of writing The Memory Artist and didn't really have like any plans to write about Japan. And it was like the deep of winter, and I went with my sister, met up with a friend from Hong Kong, and we all went into Japan together to stay with my friend Nori, who's from Nagoya. And so we had this beautiful trip in the winter. We went to Takayama, where Mai and her husband Jay traveled to. And so that, like, the winter was just like quite an evocative, like full of snow, very, very beautiful. My first experience with like the onsen culture and all of that sort of really made quite a visceral sort of bodily impression on me. And then like coming back home, and I was very fortunate to live with the most wonderful woman who's Japanese. I'm very, very happy to see is actually here tonight, dialing in from Japan. So I'm so happy to have her here. And so I think we, you know, as we housemates becoming really good friends, as you do, you talk about relationships and family and expectations and, you know, just those sorts of day-to-day conversations. And we were very interested in each other's perceptions of our own cultures. So yeah, we have these really interesting conversations about like, oh, you know, maybe in Japan we wouldn't talk so openly about that, but you know, in Australia you want to have a deep conversation about everything. And it was just this like interesting, like just not clash, but just interesting contrast that we used to talk about. And then through that friend, I've then, you know, met several other Japanese friends, and I went to Japan in 2017 and like stayed with my friend's parents, met, you know, other friends of hers who I'm now friends with. So I think it was a different sort of experience, because it was much more through, I guess, kind of just conversation. And I just sort of send like a message to a couple of my friends and be like, oh, you know, is this an accurate representation of what I'm saying about Nagoya? Or like, how would you interpret this word that denotes like obligation and shame and all these different connotations? I was like, does that mean anything to you as like a young Japanese person today? And yeah, it was just very much more just sort of, I guess, sort of natural as a process. So I think all of that sort of fed into the book and also to the notes section, which I guess we can talk about too as well. So yeah, it was as you say, like a very unconventional research process, which I think, yeah, I enjoyed it, and I wanted it to be different. So I was glad that it sort of did end up being different. And then you asked me about the sumi ink art as well. So my housemate who I was living with, we did a little bit of ink art together, but then I did some classes with Junko Akuzawa, who lives in Melbourne, and she's got so much talent. And I just did a couple of classes with her. So I just doing a couple of those classes enough to see that 3 classes is almost like, I don't know, 2 seconds in getting to be like have any skill in it. I think I spent 3 hours. This is the ink art that's just the black ink, and it's just like that beautiful sort of very clear, clean brush stroke. So you need a lot of preparation to get that one stroke right. And I think in 3 hours I might have got like a leaf done okay. It was just so difficult. But that idea of that that one gesture being so important. And I sort of write about that in the piece of sort of these artworks. They have so much depth behind them, I feel, but I think it's because of all that preparation. Like my teacher talked about, like she'd spend a week cleaning her apartment before she did. I loved that.
I'm going to start doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a process sort of thing. And I loved the idea of the gesture. And so I really, really wanted this book to be short, and it is. I think I could have had it even shorter, to be honest. Like I really wanted those 4 sections to just feel like that gesture and that sort of like glimpse, I suppose. And I didn't want it to be, it was sort of inspired by that idea of the gesture, and I didn't want it to be like too much suggesting a whole, or even though it's sort of chronological in the 4 stories. But I liked each one standing for something, but just giving a bit of an impression and an entry point in, I suppose.
Yeah, and it really works. Like I love that idea of the gesture as something also that, when it's done well, seems so effortless, but in fact, whoa, there's a lot of cleaning the apartment before you get, before you get to that stage.
In my case, it was trying to write Mai's perspective for about 2 years, and I tried to write the whole novel from that one viewpoint, and then I realized it just that was not the way the novel needed to be. Interesting second novel difficulties as well, I guess.
But I think, and that's one of the things I love most about the book, is how we get this kind of shifting perspective, and we come to understand things slightly differently, and we understand people in slightly different ways because we're getting more than one point of view. And maybe that's a good point in which to launch into another point of view, which is Hiromi's point of view. So she's Hikaru's mother, and hers was, I think my favorite section. I mean, I felt so much for her. Yeah.
I'm glad you've mentioned Hiromi, because when, as I say, I was struggling for some years with Mai's perspective, and I think because I'd written the memory artist from one character in the first person for the whole book, I was just so sure that the whole book would be from Mai's perspective. And 2 years in, I was like, I can't get beyond 30,000 words. It's just petering out, it's flat. So I tried Hiromi's perspective in this very first line I'm going to read, and her voice was just there. And I wrote this section, and I don't think I changed a thing. It just came out, but I think I needed the 2 years of not knowing what I was doing to get to that point, which I think is, interesting. So, I think, so Hiromi is Hikaru's mother, and this is her going to care for her mother down in Nagasaki. So, and it's in the summer. So I'm just going to read from a couple of her pages now. Hiromi Sato arrives in Nagasaki in the raging heat. Although this is the town of her birth, she cannot accustom herself to this air that is like fire. Standing at a tram stop heading for the old Chinatown, she wipes her brow. A tram approaches, one of the loud old ones that were here during her childhood. The tram line follows the curve of the sea. At the port of Nagasaki, there are now cafes, restaurants selling pizza and seafood, where once there was only industry. Hiromi's mother still lives in the house where Hiromi was raised. The house is 50 years old and spacious, with traditional style wooden walls and a tiled roof, old tatami on the floors that needs replacing. Hiromi has neglected her mother. She has been preoccupied with her son, Hikaru. She must get that tatami replaced. Her mother greets her outside the front door. Her grey hair is long and tied back in a bun. Hiromi wears her hair, still black, in a similar style. You came all that way. Her mother's voice has become gravelly with age. It's hot, Oka-san, says Hiromi. You shouldn't stand outside. Hiromi puts her bags down in the kitchen, and her mother spoons tea into a pot. How is the boy? Her mother asks. Hiromi opens her mouth to speak, to repeat the customary responses, the shield of lies that protect against shame. but is caught on the threshold of something else emerging from her, a confession and collapse, the wave and destruction of a city. She swallows and says that Hikaru, her son, is living with other young people, and he will start a job training program soon. Her mother nods. The air in the kitchen is very warm, but the heat is softer and drier than outside. Her failed son, she loves him. Hiromi did what she was raised to do, but something went wrong. She took control of her son's education, his health, his sleep, his clothing, his food. Her husband worked. That was how things were done. She sent her son to cram school, where the children were at their desks at 7 in the morning and released to their futons late in the evening. She found a good elementary school, and while she could not get him into the best high school in Nagoya, it was the second best, and that was where Maya Takeda would go, and that was good, she thought. The pressure and expectation have always felt monumental, almost religious, like the eyes and hands of gods haunt her, and her failures amount to disrespect of them. And so the fear has always been monumental too, because the consequences would come from a place beyond her, over there on the other side, where the presence that she has long felt is watching and pressuring her resides. She has met these pressures. She must pay her duties to that presence every day.
Thanks so much, Catherine. There's one of the really wonderful things I think that comes through in the book is a kind of cross-generational or intergenerational kind of, you represent with each character really at least kind of 3 generations in that kind of family dynamic. And the more I read the book and the more I thought about it, the more I also felt that there's a kind of spectre hanging over. So this is Japan in 2014, and that spectre is the Second World War, and especially the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And there are a couple of really kind of interesting points, sometimes in the note section, sometimes I think in fact there's I'm just gonna I think this is in Hiromi's section, but I'm just going to read it because I think this is an image you kind of return to again and again, and it's also a question the narrator of the notes section asks herself. So she's just been, she's in Nagasaki to see her mother, and she says, there are advertisements for Urakami Cathedral outside the train's window. Only the facade was left after the bombing. The cathedral was entirely rebuilt. Any trace of the damage is hidden by the new. And there are a couple of points. There's another point where the narrator of the note section asks herself, is it better to leave the wound visible or to conceal the wound? And I wonder, I wonder what you make of the kind of connection perhaps with Hikaru, that kind of bursting force of a kind of wound in a way, and the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Yeah, I think with, I guess for some background information, like with the memory artist, I was so fascinated by sort of traumatic memory and it's passing through generations, and so much of that book is about that and about sort of how memory can be expressed and silenced in spaces. So for me, like wanting to sort of engage with those themes again of like intergenerational trauma was something that was always, I think, a pull for me to Japan, because like Russia had asked similar questions sort of me as a researcher, I suppose. So I think what I was really struck by with that Urakami Cathedral being recreated, rebuilt with the facade there, sort of the, the trauma sort of you don't quite see it, but I guess you know it through story. Whereas when I went to Hiroshima, I just was so overwhelmed by the old dome building there that is, they've left that, as a decision, left that completely exposed as it was in the bombing. So when you look at sort of aerial shots of Hiroshima just after the bombing, you see that dome. And then when you go visit it now as a tourist, you see the dome pretty much as it was. It's got a real bird cage feel about it. It's just got a bit of like the wooden structure still evident. So, and me, going there was really, really moved by that. So I wanted to sort of find a way to put that in. But I think what you say about the sort of the generational, like, I guess, flow on effect was something that always sort of, I guess, was something that I wanted to write about. But again, I was grappling with that challenge of sort of wanting it to not feel too much like a historical book. I really wanted it to be rooted in the present, but to have that past sort of, I guess, hanging over it, but haunting it in more realistic ways, in the sense of, like, in The Memory Artist, it's very obvious this person is sort of obsessed with the past and is always sort of writing about it and seeking it. Whereas I wanted to have the past having a bit more of a sort of a lurking feel, maybe not quite so conscious in the shut-ins. So what I was really sort of, I guess, influenced by was just the narrative after World War II and the surrender by Japan, was that in the 60s and 70s, Japan saw this incredible growth and, incredible recovery, really. And it became sort of this, manufacturing and, technological sort of powerhouse in a lot of ways, with its manufacturing. Like Nagoya is a city that's very much like that. A lot of the big factories are around there, Toyota, Yamaha, all of those sorts of brands, that sort of thing. And so there was this huge sort of, I guess, with the generation that had that success and worked within that success, those structures worked because, devoting yourself entirely to your education, to the company, was a way to, maintain some, I guess, sense of pride and purpose. And it I guess it kind of worked. But then Japan went through a series of recessions, like the 90s, 2008. So this younger generation is sort of going, well, what do we do? Those structures don't necessarily, like, that path doesn't necessarily guarantee success. So I don't know if I want to go down that, because there's no guarantees with that. And I guess also with, with the internet, with the online world, you do see that, I guess, other side, other possibilities. So yeah, I was interested in that trajectory. So Hiromi, as somebody who would have been raised by parents who survived World War II, raised her in a very sort of strict household, that way of life, that company sort of devotion was very important. So she married the company man, but then Mai is sort of still following that path in some ways. So I think that's sort of how I wanted to thread the story of the history, but I guess through that more subtle way of sort of the pressure that it maybe forms, and maybe the people who are feeling it don't necessarily articulate it particularly like in their present knowledge, but it's there. It's sort of like a lurking presence, I suppose.
Yeah. And same a bit like in Ferrante, say you get these references in the generation after the Second World War to kind of, that things happened, but you're not quite sure, and that, parents don't speak directly to their children about that kind of history and so on. So it is very subtle, but it's also very affecting, I think. Yeah. I'm going to open up to questions from the floor any moment. So if you have a question, write it into the chat now for Robert. But while people do that, I just want to ask one more question, if I may. There's so much more I could ask, but I'm going to restrain myself. And that kind of follows on from what you were just saying, these kind of circumstances that are specific to Japan in some way. But also the more I read The Shut-ins and the more I reread it, the more I wondered too if there is some version of this experience that is common. It's a human problem, right? Like in some contexts, you might call this a sense of alienation, perhaps. In other, I kept thinking back to this thing I read years ago, and I can't remember where it was now, but it was a report about the percentage of people, which seemed strangely high to me, who they find, like in the event of, say, a big rail crash or some other kind of shocking event in which some people die and some people are injured, the number of people who actually just walk away from that and just leave their lives behind without leaving any kind of trace. So their bodies aren't found. They, you know, but they don't return to their families. They kind of use that kind of shock as an opportunity to recreate a life for themselves. And I kept thinking of that in connection with Hikaru's retreat, almost like a way of kind of. And so do you think, despite the kind of particularities of history or culture or geography or whatever, do you think there is, that part of this is just a basic kind of human experience and a human kind of gesture towards the other side?
Yeah, I think so. It's so interesting that you mentioned that idea of shock, because in one of the first articles I read that mentioned Achiragawa, the catalyst moment is shock, and they call it the shock of the real.
Yeah.
I'll have to send you this
I'd love to
article
read it.
Yeah, and it's that idea that, you know, something does happen. So like in Japan, like the big earthquake in Kobe that Murakami is sort of quite, you know, influenced by. He's from there, and he often mentions that as a real shock event in Japan. And then the sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway is another shock event. But to answer your question, I think I couldn't have written this if there wasn't some entry point in there that I could write from in some way, I guess, like feeling some kind of connection to these ideas. And I think that's where I think it was really interesting for me to write the notes sections, which sort of I had not planned to put in. They came in really, really late in the writing process, but I had all this material that was sort of a bit of a journal of me being in Japan and writing notes, and then me wanting to sort of write what these ideas meant to me, because the other side and this idea of being a shut-in, like I think I was so fascinated by that, because I think a lot of people, just like you say, it relates to this idea of alienation. And hikikomori is a term that's been coined in Japan because there happens to be a high number of hikikomori there. But I think, you know, there's been research done to show that there are a high number of sort of, you know, shut-ins, as they're called, in Italy, in Spain, in Korea, and a number of other countries. But I think these feelings, this sort of that questioning moment, I suppose, always kind of interests me. I think, I think writers, I think in particular, we sort of feel that maybe the world that we're living through each day, we're always on a bit of a like alert feeling of wanting to question things, I suppose, and sort of like wanting to know if it's the right path. But I've seen that with, you know, plenty of friends as well. And I think it is just maybe part of human nature that we're always questioning. But I also think there's a real value to it, because we, you know, by questioning things, that's the only way to see that some structures are just not working and some ways of being are just not working. They're not particularly, productive or conducive to good physical or mental health, all of those sorts of things. I think it's true. Like, I think I love that your question sort of captures the complexities of it, because it's so easy to say, like, oh, we all know what it's like to be shut in. It's also, you know, it's a universal experience. And I think there's some real, there's truth to that, but there's also some real strong cultural factors that influence that. So that's where the history, I think, was important for me to sort of know and engage with as well.
Well, maybe that on the note of questioning, maybe that's a great place for us to end our conversation, and we'll stop recording now and turn over to Robert, and he will read some questions that have come through on the chat.